We've long known that humanity was never alone. Neanderthals once roamed across Europe and Central Asia, and the Flores people settled on tiny tropical islands. And during the Ice Age, a mysterious group of humans lived deep in Asia. They were called the Denisovans. We've only found a few fragments of their bones, and their DNA lives on in millions of people today. Yet for over a decade, they were just a name, nothing more. But now, scientists have finally been able to put a face to that name. And the more we learn, the stranger things become. What kind of world did they live in? Who did they encounter? Could they have lived far longer than we imagined? Maybe even survived beyond the Ice Age? And were they truly the giants of legend, as the stories say? Today, let's explore who the Denisovans really were, who they truly are, what's fact, and what mysteries remain still waiting to be solved. The story begins in 2011, with a tiny finger bone found in an icy cave in Siberia. At first, scientists thought it belonged to a Neanderthal, but DNA testing left them completely stunned. It wasn't a match. This was a brand new branch on the human family tree. They gave it a name, the Denisovans, named after the cave where it was found, Denisova Cave, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. 2 years later, another bone fragment was tested. It turned out to be from a girl. Her mother was Neanderthal, her father Denisovan. This remains the only known case of a confirmed prehistoric hybrid child, the first generation mix of two human species. And this remarkable cave seems to have been a major crossroads of humanity. For thousands of years, people came and went, and the artifacts they left behind are astonishing. A polished red stone bracelet, with tiny precision-drilled holes, crafted with remarkable skill and technique. There were also other advanced tools, possibly even works of art. These people were clearly not primitive savages. They had culture, perhaps even a sense of aesthetics. But what's truly strange is, outside of this one cave, the Denisovans seem to have vanished without a trace. For over a decade, nothing was found except a few bone fragments. But the issue is, their DNA still exists today, in the bodies of hundreds of millions of people. So how could they have left behind no trace at all? Until 2011, when a shocking discovery was announced. Chinese scientists revealed a massive human skull, unearthed from the Songhua River Basin, in northeastern China. The skull was dubbed Dragon Man, scientifically known as Homo longi. Its origin was anything but ordinary. It was first discovered by a worker back in the 1930s. While building a bridge to protect the relic from war destruction, he secretly hid it away, and it remained hidden for decades, until recently, when scientists finally examined it using CT scans and modern technology. The results were truly astonishing. It turned out to be one of the best preserved ancient human skulls in East Asian archaeology, estimated to be around 146,000 years old, and the brain was anything but ordinary. Its cranial capacity was 1,420 cubic centimeters, not only matching that of Neanderthals, but even larger than modern humans, by up to 10%. But what's most astonishing was the combination of facial features. A massive brow ridge stood out above the eyes, even more prominent than in Neanderthals. A wide, flat face and an enormous nose, likely adaptations to cold and dry climates. The teeth were also large and strong. DNA analysis revealed these powerful teeth were a unique trait of the Denisovans. Their skulls were low, long, and lacked a chin. This trait was fairly common among Neanderthals and other archaic humans, but it's completely different from us modern humans. In many ways, the Longjong skull acts like a bridge, connecting ancient East Asian humans with Neanderthals. On one hand, it resembles the Dali skull, found in northern China. It also bears similarities to the Soloman fossil from Java, Indonesia. But it carries the rugged features of the Neanderthals. In short, compared to us modern humans, the difference is striking and far from simple. When combined with the tools found in Denisova Cave and the craftsmanship involved, these clues all point to a complex archaic species with extraordinary environmental adaptability. But here's the question: was the Longjong skull truly Denisovan? At first, scientists were cautious. They gave it a separate name, Homo longi, treating it as an entirely new species. An entire branch based on just one skull. But as more and more data emerged, a new picture gradually took shape. Studies revealed that the skull's structure closely matched a Denisovan lower jaw, discovered in Tibet. This connection was confirmed in 2019 through bone structure and skeletal features. What's more, genetic studies from that year also showed that Denisovans actually had a much wider distribution, with several distinct population groups. The Longjong human was very likely part of the East Asian branch. Finally, in June 2015, a groundbreaking study was released. Researcher Fu Chaoming and her team successfully extracted mitochondrial DNA from the dental calculus of the only tooth preserved in the Longjong skull, and the results stunned everyone. Even after eliminating all potentially contaminated samples, the ancient DNA they extracted still matched perfectly with the sample from the Denisovan remains discovered in southern Siberia. Moreover, it contained 27 genetic variants, previously found only in 7 Denisovan individuals, whose genomes had been sequenced before. These variants were found in no one else. Isn't that solid proof? Even protein analysis told the same story. A unique set of Denisovan proteins, preserved in the Longjong specimen. However, that said, not everyone found it easy to accept. One Chinese paleoanthropologist, not involved in the genetic study, raised the concern: was the DNA possibly contaminated by modern sources? In fact, modern DNA traces were indeed found in the tooth. But Fu Chaoming's team had an extremely strict extraction process. They carefully isolated only ancient fragments. As a result, by 2015, the Longjong skull was not just a promising candidate. It became the first skull ever confirmed to belong to a Denisovan through both protein and DNA analysis. Now, for the first time, we have both the face and the genetic code of a Denisovan. This allows researchers to re-examine other ancient skulls found across Asia to see which ones may relate to the Longjong specimen. This isn't just a fossil. It's a turning point in the story of human evolution. It proves beyond doubt that the Denisovans were not a minor group, not just hiding in a remote corner of Siberia. They were widespread, genetically diverse, and present across East Asia. And their story is only just beginning to unfold. To many people, human evolution seems like a straight line, from primitive apes, slowly evolving into modern humans. But that's only a tiny part of the truth. The truth is far richer and stranger than that. Modern humans, in fact, share common ancestors with Neanderthals and Denisovans. It's like one big extended family. You could think of them as our cousins. We didn't evolve from them, we all came from the same root, but branched off differently. The shared ancestor of sapiens, modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, lived around 600 to 800,000 years ago. At some point afterward, the Neanderthal and Denisovan branches split off from the one that would evolve into modern humans. A few 100,000 years later, Neanderthals and Denisovans separated from each other. One branch moved westward, settling Europe and Central Asia. The other went east, spreading widely across Asia. And it was in this vast Asian landscape that Denisovans accomplished something extraordinary. They adapted to all kinds of extreme environments. Just imagine, from the icy Tibetan plateau, to the dusty plains of northern China, to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, Denisovans managed to survive in all of them. Such wildly different places. Their survival ability must have been incredible. In Melanesia, the wild animals there weighed 3 times more than today's largest elephants. And there was one species they almost certainly encountered: Gigantopithecus, the giant ape, the largest ape in history. Just imagine the interactions between Denisovans and them. When a tiger approached, did they hide deep in the jungle? Or did they sneak up while the parent apes weren't watching and hunt the young ones? The world of the Denisovans is truly mind-blowing. An entire continent held by one species of humans that we still know so little about. Denisovan skulls were massive. In many ways, they closely resembled Neanderthals. They were rugged and strong, well adapted to the cold climate of the Ice Age. But they also had their own traits, such as flatter faces and larger teeth. As mentioned earlier, Denisovans were actually very genetically diverse. There were at least 2, or possibly 3, distinct groups. One was the high-altitude Denisovan group, whose DNA was found in the tiny finger bone from Siberia. Another group had genes leaning more to the south, and another, even more southern lineage, still exists today in Papua New Guinea, Australia, and parts of Southeast Asia. Now, with the Longjong skull, we know there was also a branch in East Asia. They had distinct morphology, yet were clearly Denisovan. This shows us something important. Denisovans were not just some small tribe hidden away somewhere. They were a widespread and complex group, active throughout much of Asia, just as Neanderthals were across Europe. Culturally, they were far from primitive too. In Denisova Cave, archaeologists uncovered sophisticated stone tools, symbolic artifacts, and even jewelry. Although these finds are impressive, we can't say for certain that they were made by the Denisovans, because at that time, modern humans had already entered the region. But the legacy of the Denisovans runs deeper than artifacts. Their genes continue to influence us today. Because when Homo sapiens, our species, began migrating out of Africa, there were already other human species around, and what happened when we met wasn't just war and conflict. To some extent, we interbred with them, and their genes still live on in our bodies today. For example, nearly all populations outside of Africa carry some amount of Neanderthal DNA. Take myself, for example. I have just under 2% in my body. But Denisovan DNA is a different story. It's not evenly distributed worldwide. If your ancestors came from Europe, you likely have little to no Denisovan DNA in your body. But if your ancestors came from Papua New Guinea, Australia's Aboriginal peoples, or parts of Southeast Asia or the Philippines, then the story is very different. So where exactly did these encounters take place? Evidence suggests there were multiple instances of contact between Denisovans and modern humans. The first likely happened as Homo sapiens migrated eastward, moving across all of Asia, through Siberia, China, and beyond. The second wave happened farther south, as humans spread into the islands of Southeast Asia. Genetic models suggest this second encounter may have taken place around 45,000 to 55,000 years ago, right when Homo sapiens first arrived in those new lands. And even more interestingly, some groups that were isolated for long periods, such as the people of the Andaman Islands, show almost no trace of Denisovan DNA. This suggests these interbreeding events weren't global phenomena, but rather isolated incidents between specific human groups at particular times and places. Yet the genetic legacy of those encounters still affects us. To this very day, some Denisovan genes, without a doubt, help certain human groups survive better. For example, on the Tibetan Plateau, the EPAS1 gene found in locals was inherited from Denisovans. This gene allows them to breathe easily in high-altitude, low-oxygen environments where others would struggle. This isn't just ancient history. It's a survival code passed down by our ancestors. Other genetic influences are more subtle, like immunity, fat metabolism, and even bone structure. And unlike Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA isn't evenly spread. It accounts for only a tiny fraction among East Asian populations. But in Oceania, especially in Papua New Guineans, Aboriginal Australians, and some island populations, Denisovan DNA levels were astonishingly high, reaching up to 4% to 6% of their total genome. Papuan and New Guinean populations living at various elevations not only carry different amounts of Denisovan DNA, but even different types of it. Lowland populations tend to have genes that boost the immune system, while highland groups carry gene variants linked to early brain development. Even more fascinating, this study suggests an exciting possibility that Denisovans may have crossed the Wallace Line. The Wallace Line is a natural boundary of species distribution between Asia and Australia. Many animal species have never crossed it. We know early Homo sapiens somehow managed to make the journey. And now, it seems Denisovans may have done so too. If future fossil evidence confirms it, then the known range of Denisovan activity will expand significantly. This would also suggest that they not only traveled vast stretches of land, but may have also crossed seas, navigating open waters. So from genetic evidence alone, an incredible story is starting to emerge. The Denisovans may have lived in Southeast Asia for a very, very long time, possibly forming a massive population. Even though we still lack fossils and archaeological evidence, they were clearly not just a minor evolutionary branch. They were, in fact, the Asian counterpart to Neanderthals. As for how long they survived, that may be one of the toughest questions. In the mystery of the Denisovans, there's a chance they lived much longer than we imagined. Could it be they even witnessed the end of the Ice Age? Perhaps hiding on a remote mountaintop, or surviving on a forgotten island, hanging on in the shadows, becoming the youngest known Denisovans. The most recent were found in Denisova Cave, Siberia, dating back about 55,000 years. But don't forget, that was just one cave, and it was in one of the coldest, harshest corners of their range. That alone tells us nothing about whether they survived longer elsewhere. What if we excavated in northern China, in the jungles of Vietnam, or deep in the Pacific Islands? Could we uncover astonishing new secrets? A 2019 genetic study revealed shocking evidence. Denisovans may have existed far longer than we ever imagined. The paper pointed out that, based on interbreeding times and the geographical structure of modern human populations, Denisovans may have lived until 35,000 years ago, possibly even until 14,550 years ago. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? Because we've long thought Neanderthals went extinct around 38,000 years ago. If Denisovans survived until over 14,000 years ago, they would have nearly witnessed the end of the last ice age. That would make them possibly the last known archaic humans, the final survivors of our ancient cousins. But with that, the mystery only deepens. The fossil record in Southeast Asian islands is extremely sparse. Thick jungles, humid soils, all these destroy bones easily. And more than that, rising sea levels have submerged many ancient sites. So our understanding of Denisovans in this region remains very limited. We may not find fossils, but their DNA speaks loudly. Especially in Southeast Asia, Denisovan gene levels are extremely high in many populations. That suggests, as Homo sapiens entered these regions, they most likely encountered Denisovans somewhere in what's now Indonesia. And even within a single island like Papua New Guinea, the levels of Denisovan DNA varied between different groups. That suggests some groups may have encountered Denisovans later, and more often. Could there have been isolated groups of Denisovans, smaller versions, barely surviving on remote islands for a very long time afterward? It's entirely possible. Don't forget, many island legends speak of other mysterious peoples, tall, strong, and unknown, or strange outsiders with odd behaviors who came from afar, appearing and vanishing. Could these be echoes of the Denisovans? Of course, legends are not evidence. But when combined with genetic clues and a lack of fossil remains, the idea becomes more intriguing. What's more, archaeology in Southeast Asia is still in its early stages. Many places have yet to be properly excavated. So in the next few decades, we may unearth stunning new evidence. So we can now boldly say, Denisovans were likely far more numerous than we thought, lived longer, and may have even briefly overlapped with human history, written history. And until we dig deeper, no one truly knows the answers. But when it comes to the Denisovans, a mystery species like this, as long as questions remain, myths and legends will continue to seep into popular culture. And among all the Denisovan legends, there's one theory that refuses to die: that they were giants. Just browse the internet, and you'll definitely run into this theory. That Denisovans were 2.4 meters tall, rulers of a lost civilization. And some even say, they crossed oceans to the Americas, and created the mysterious mound cultures. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? But the question is there any evidence to support these theories? Let's see what science has to say. First off, yes, the Longjong skull is large. Its cranial volume reached 1,420 cubic centimeters, which is quite big. But remember, big head doesn't always mean big body. A large skull doesn't guarantee a tall stature. Take Neanderthals, for example. Some of them had cranial capacities that reached up to 1,618 cubic centimeters, even larger than Dragon Man's. But their average height was only about 165 centimeters. Short, but very strong-bodied. The classic muscular build. They couldn't be called giants at all. So what about the Denisovans? Based on fossil inferences, DNA, and scattered evidence, their body proportions were likely similar to Neanderthals, short and stocky. Their sturdy build likely evolved to adapt to cold, harsh climates, and their large teeth and wide faces probably helped them chew ancient tough, fibrous foods. There were other archaic humans too, like the hobbits, or Homo floresiensis, who stood only about 1.5 to 1.6 meters tall, not even reaching modern height averages. So what does this tell us? It shows that if we interpret fossils out of context or carelessly, it can easily lead to misunderstanding. So, if someone tells you Denisovans were giants, you can confidently say they're sensationalizing. Clickbait. There's absolutely no evidence that Denisovans were giants. Their body build was likely similar to that of their close relatives, the Neanderthals. So where did the giant myth come from? One reason is, human imagination is incredibly vivid. When there's a gap in the fossil record, we can't help but fill it with myth. Another reason is that during the 19th century, many reports surfaced about giant skeletons. Many of these stories were exaggerated, faked, or misinterpreted. Back then, newspapers loved to sensationalize, claiming discoveries of huge Native American remains, either of naturally tall people or individuals buried in ceremonial ways. But many of these theories, later on, fringe theories, forcefully grafted these myths onto the Denisovans, even though they left no fossils in the Americas. There's no archaeological evidence that Denisovans ever set foot in the New World, nor is there any DNA proving Denisovan populations in the Americas. Although today's Native Americans do carry traces of Denisovan DNA, that DNA didn't come from interbreeding in the Americas, but rather from their ancestors, who interbred with Denisovans while still in Asia. Only later did those ancestors cross the Bering Strait and arrive in the Americas. Of course, if we actually did dig up a 2.4 meter tall ancient giant who chased mammoths and wrestled cave bears, that would be truly astonishing. But honestly, even without the myths, the true story of the Denisovans is explosive enough. They were a branch that split off from the human lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. They spread widely across all of Asia. They survived in these lands for tens of thousands of years, and even left behind valuable genes that benefit us, modern humans, today. That's the real story, and it's far more fascinating than any legend about giants. Because they weren't monsters. They weren't myths. They were flesh and blood. They were our genetic cousins. Ancient people who walked this land long before we ever left Africa. And their story has only just begun to unfold. And their story is just beginning to be revealed.